the forest never forgot what happened there. Even now, the wind carries the faint sound of hymns, broken voices echoing through the mist, as if the earth itself remembers the vows that should never have been spoken. Deep within the Appalachian wilderness lies a cabin that was never meant to be found, swallowed by time and overgrown with vines that twist like the secrets buried beneath them. Locals say the forest grew thicker around it, as if nature itself tried to hide the sin that once took place inside. It began with a map that wasn't supposed to exist, an old ranger's sketch found in the back of a library drawer, drawn in pencil so faint it nearly vanished under touch. 3 hikers, all college friends chasing forgotten trails for thrill and footage, traced the map through the Appalachian ridges, believing they'd find nothing more than an abandoned mine or logging camp. The forest swallowed the trail quickly. The further they went, the quieter it became, until even the usual chirping of insects dulled into a thick, pressing silence. The air smelled of damp earth and rot, the kind that clings to the lungs and makes every breath feel like trespass. The trees grew older here, gnarled and heavy, their roots coiled over rocks like skeletal fingers. They joked less as the light thinned. It was near dusk when they saw it, a structure half hidden behind a curtain of ivy and birch, barely recognizable as a cabin beneath the weight of years. One corner of the roof had caved in, but smoke, thin, white, almost invisible, rose from the broken chimney. That single detail froze them all. No one had lived within 30 miles of that ridge for decades, according to the ranger who'd drawn the map. And yet the cabin breathed, faintly alive in the chill of the evening. The door, if it could be called that, hung open just enough to reveal a dim interior. One of them called out, voice trembling somewhere between politeness and fear. No answer came, only the groan of wood shifting in the wind. They stepped inside. The first thing that struck them was the smell, not decay, not the sour tang of death, but something oddly domestic, candle wax, old fabric, the faint sweetness of dried flowers. Dust floated through the fading light like ash, and everything seemed left mid-motion, as if the occupants had only stepped outside a moment ago. A chair lay overturned near the hearth. On the wall hung 2 portraits, painted in crude oil, one of a man, one of a young woman. The faces were eerily similar. It wasn't just the shared color of their eyes or the curve of their mouths, it was as if the same bloodline had drawn itself twice. On a small table between the portraits rested a framed photograph, its glass cracked but the image intact. A woman stared back, wearing 2 rings on her left hand. Both bore the same last name. One of the hikers reached out to lift the frame, but before he could, the sound of something moving above them, slow, deliberate steps across the attic floor, froze them where they stood, the air around them growing colder with each breath. The photograph lay on the table like an accusation, its cracked glass catching the dim light that filtered through the broken roof. One of the hikers, the youngest of the 3, brushed away the dust and leaned closer, his breath fogging the surface. At first, it seemed ordinary, just an old wedding portrait, the kind you might find in any forgotten farmhouse. But then they noticed it, the woman's left hand resting gently against her chest, 2 simple gold bands glinting on the same finger. The rings were nearly identical, engraved with the same last name. The longer they stared, the more wrong it felt, as though the image itself carried a quiet unease. The woman's expression was hard to read, not joy, not sorrow, but something distant, like a memory she didn't want to keep. Her eyes, dark and fixed, seemed to look past the camera, past the moment, into something only she could see. They turned the photograph over, expecting perhaps a date or a name, but the back was blank, save for a faint brown stain that looked uncomfortably like dried blood. The wood of the frame was old but well made, carved by hand, and when one of them pried it open to inspect the photo more closely, a folded scrap of paper fell from inside. It was a note, barely legible, written in a looping, feminine hand. He said we must share everything, even the vow. No one spoke after reading it. The silence between them thickened until it pressed against their throats. Outside, the forest seemed to close in, branches scraping against the cabin walls with a slow, rhythmic sound that felt almost intentional. One of them, trying to shake off the unease, lifted the photograph again and brought it closer to the light. The man beside the woman, her groom, presumably, had his face half turned toward her, his hand resting over hers. His features were sharp, almost too sharp, and his resemblance to the bride was unmistakable. Brother and sister, perhaps. Or something worse, something the world wasn't meant to name. The older hiker muttered that it might be a coincidence, a family resemblance exaggerated by old film. But even as he said it, his voice faltered. There was a strange comfort in pretending logic could explain what they were seeing, yet every instinct screamed that this photo wasn't meant to be found. As the wind howled through the broken chimney, the two rings caught the firelight again, gleaming like twin eyes. For a fleeting moment, one of the hikers swore he saw the faintest shift in the woman's expression, as though, behind the cracked glass, she was finally aware of being watched. The night settled heavy around the cabin, pressing its weight into the walls until even the timbers seemed to creak under the strain. None of them wanted to sleep there, yet leaving meant trekking miles through unfamiliar woods in darkness that swallowed even the beam of a flashlight. So they stayed, building a small fire in the hearth and trying not to look at the photograph on the table. Every flicker of flame seemed to bring her eyes to life again. As they sat in uneasy silence, the youngest of the three noticed something odd about the floor beneath the rug. One plank sat slightly higher than the rest, the nails rusted and loose. He tapped it with his boot, and it gave a hollow sound that didn't belong in solid wood. Curiosity won over fear. They pried the board up, dust rising like a ghost in the firelight. Beneath it lay a shallow compartment wrapped in a thin sheet of oilcloth, tied with brittle twine that crumbled at their touch. Inside was a book, its leather cover cracked, its pages yellowed to the color of bone. It wasn't a diary in the ordinary sense, it was a journal written by a preacher, his penmanship careful but trembling, the ink faded by years of damp air. The first entry was dated 1973, the same year carved into the lintel above the door. They read by the light of the dying fire, turning each page with reverence and dread. The preacher described his journey to a remote part of the mountains, summoned by a family whose name he'd been instructed never to record. He wrote of a ceremony that was to be held in secret, away from the eyes of the town and the church. He had hesitated, sensing sin in their secrecy, but the family had offered him money, more than he'd ever seen, and something else, something he refused to describe except as a promise of belonging. The handwriting grew erratic with each page, as though fear had taken his hand. One passage made them all fall silent. The preacher wrote of the bride and groom standing before him, their faces nearly identical, their hands trembling but eager. They told me it was their destiny, he wrote. They said the blood must remain whole, that love is purest when it comes from within itself. The final line of that entry bled off into a smear of ink, as if the pen had been yanked from his hand mid-sentence. The hikers exchanged uneasy glances, each one silently wondering what had become of the men who wrote those words, and what else might still be buried beneath the floorboards. The journal left them shaken, its words echoing through the cabin long after they stopped reading. None of it made sense, and yet every detail felt too real to dismiss. When dawn finally broke, pale and thin through the cracked windows, they packed up the book and decided to take it into town, hoping to find records, anything, that could confirm the story written in its pages. The nearest town lay 2 hours down a dirt road that twisted between the ridges like a scar. It was a place that looked stuck in another century, with hand-painted signs, a single diner, and a library that smelled of mildew and old paper. The librarian, a woman in her 70s with sharp eyes and a cautious voice, listened as they explained what they'd found. When they mentioned the year 1973 and the preacher's name, something in her face changed, just for a second, but enough to notice. She led them to a back room lined with county archives, binders filled with faded certificates and handwritten records of births, marriages, and deaths. They combed through the files for hours until one of them found what seemed to match, a marriage license issued in the fall of 1973. The groom's name was clear, written in a neat, confident script, but the bride's name had been scratched out so violently that the paper tore beneath the ink. It wasn't just a simple erasure, it was an act of intent, a deliberate removal. The librarian frowned, tracing the ragged mark with her fingertip. "That shouldn't be possible," she murmured. "We keep backups." But when she checked the microfilm archives, the same record was missing there too. Every copy, every duplicate, every entry that should have confirmed the bride's name was gone, as if she had never existed. The hikers exchanged uneasy glances. One of them asked about the preacher, hoping his name might lead somewhere. The librarian hesitated before admitting that he, too, had vanished from the record books after that year. No obituary, no transfer notice, not even a resignation from his parish. His file ended abruptly, the way his journal had. The librarian finally closed the binder and said softly, "Some things were better left forgotten in these parts." When they left the building, the sun had dipped low, and the shadows of the mountains stretched long across the empty streets. In the distance, the forest they'd come from seemed to watch them, as though it already knew they had unearthed something that was never meant to see daylight again. The drive back to the woods was quiet, the kind of silence that hummed beneath the sound of the engine. None of them spoke about what they'd found in the records office, but each felt the weight of the missing name like a stone pressing on their chests. They stopped at a small diner on the edge of town, the kind of place where the walls were lined with old photographs and the same two men had probably sat at the counter every day for 30 years. When the hikers asked if anyone remembered a preacher from the early 70s who might have lived near the ridge, the waitress froze with the coffee pot halfway to a cup. Her smile faltered. She set the pot down carefully, as if afraid of drawing attention to herself, and leaned in close enough that her voice became a whisper. "You found that cabin, didn't you?" Her words turned heads. The old man at the counter lowered his newspaper, eyes narrowing with something that wasn't surprise but recognition. The waitress warned them quietly not to go back, saying that the people who once lived there weren't like others. They kept to themselves, always had. When one of the hikers asked what that meant, the old man finally spoke. His voice was rough, brittle with age, but steady. He said there used to be a family in those woods, a name no one dared to repeat now, who believed they were chosen, bound to the land by blood and by something older than law or faith. They married only among themselves, generation after generation, because they believed their purity kept the forest from turning against them. Another man from a corner booth added that when outsiders tried to intervene, when social workers came looking for children who hadn't been to school or doctors in years, they disappeared. The sheriff called it coincidence. The locals called it warning. The old man said the family's homestead was more than just a cabin, it was a sanctuary built to keep their lineage intact. To them, marriage wasn't about love but preservation, a ritual meant to seal their claim to the woods. They said the blood makes the land fertile, he muttered, staring into his coffee. And the land feeds the blood in return. When the hikers pressed for names or dates, no one answered. The waitress just crossed herself, even though the motion felt out of place in that dim, dusty diner. "If you're smart," she whispered, "you'll let that story stay buried." That family didn't just disappear. The woods took them back. The journal's next few pages revealed what the hikers could only describe as the night everything went wrong. The preacher's tone shifted from cautious to desperate, his handwriting breaking apart with every line. He wrote about the invitation to perform the ceremony deep in the forest, how two men from the family had come to his door late one evening, faces hidden under wide-brimmed hats, offering payment in old silver coins. He hesitated at first, uneasy about their strange manner and the way they never blinked when they spoke, but poverty and curiosity drove him to accept. The entry described how he followed them for miles through woods so dense that the moonlight barely reached the ground. The further they went, the quieter it became, until even his own footsteps seemed swallowed by the earth. When they reached the clearing, the preacher found the family waiting. Lanterns hung from the trees in a circle, their yellow glow trembling in the night wind. The bride and groom stood at the center, pale and still, dressed in clothing that looked decades out of time. The groom's eyes were fixed on the bride with a look that wasn't love but possession, a fierce hunger that made the preacher's hands shake as he opened his Bible. The bride never once met the preacher's gaze, she kept her eyes on the dark woods beyond the lanterns, as though she were listening to something no one else could hear. The preacher began the vows, his voice faltering over the words as he noticed how eerily similar the two appeared, the same sharp cheekbones, the same curve of the mouth, even the same faint scar on the side of their necks. When he reached the moment to ask if anyone objected, a gust of wind rushed through the clearing, blowing out several lanterns. The family members surrounding them didn't move, their faces blank, their eyes reflecting the dying light. Somewhere far beyond the trees came the sound of an animal's cry, long, low, and mournful. The groom took the bride's hand then and whispered something close to her ear. The preacher wrote the words exactly as he heard them, "We were born from the same root." The preacher's writing grew almost unreadable after that. He described the forest going utterly silent, the air thick and heavy, the feeling of being watched by something that wasn't human. The final line of that night's entry read simply, "I knew then this was no wedding in the eyes of God." The journal's pages after the ceremony were filled with confusion, guilt, and something close to terror. The preacher's words no longer carried the steady tone of a man of faith but the trembling confessions of someone who had seen something he could not name. He wrote of how the family insisted he stay for the night, claiming the mountain was too dangerous to travel after dark. He agreed, though unease crawled in his chest with every hour that passed. They gave him a room in a smaller cabin behind the main house. Through the thin walls, he could hear voices whispering long into the night, ritual words spoken in a language older than English, followed by what he described as the sound of crying that wasn't grief but birth. He tried to pray, but the words felt hollow in his mouth. The next morning, the family gathered again outside, their faces pale from exhaustion, their clothes stained with something dark. He saw the young bride lying inside the main cabin, motionless except for her shallow breathing. A woman he assumed to be her mother sat beside her, stroking her hair and humming a tune that sounded more like mourning than comfort. No one spoke of what had happened, but he wrote that the silence told him enough. The bride had given birth, and yet there was no sound of an infant, only the echo of something small shifting under blankets in the corner. He wasn't allowed to see. When he tried to ask, the groom placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm enough to bruise, and said softly, "She bore our future. The forest will raise it." The preacher wanted to leave, but the family insisted he rest before returning to town. That night, as the moon rose, he heard movement outside his cabin, the soft creak of footsteps circling, the faint whimper of something that might have been a child. He pressed his face to the window, but the darkness outside was complete. The next entry was written in frantic strokes, the ink blotched from shaking hands. He claimed to have seen the family carrying something small into the woods, wrapped in white cloth, their voices low and reverent. The bride was not among them. He ended the passage by admitting he could not sleep, haunted by the single phrase the groom had repeated during the ceremony, "blood remembers." The preacher wrote that he finally understood what it meant, that the child born in silence was not meant to belong to this world. The next entries in the journal grew increasingly disjointed, as if the preacher's mind was unraveling alongside his words. Days passed between sentences, and what he did manage to write suggested that time itself had begun to blur for him. He described trying to leave the valley, but every path he took seemed to lead him back to the same place, the cabin, the clearing, the family. He would walk for hours, certain he was heading toward the road, only to find himself again at the edge of the lantern circle where the wedding had taken place. Each return left him weaker, hungrier, and more desperate. The family never questioned his presence, they simply greeted him each time as though he had never left, offering food and speaking softly of how the mountain decides who stays. He wrote of the bride then, or what remained of her. She no longer moved about the house but stayed in bed, her face gaunt, her eyes glassy and unfocused. Her hands trembled when she reached for the child, which the preacher finally saw one night by accident. He didn't describe it fully, only that the infant's skin was too pale, too smooth, and its gaze too knowing for something so new. He tried to baptize it in secret, hoping to free it from whatever curse had been placed upon its birth, but when he touched the water to its forehead, it let out a sound that made the walls shake and the lamps flicker. The family rushed in, surrounding him with faces stripped of all warmth. The groom told him in a calm, steady voice that the child belonged to the woods now and that his duty to God had ended the night he performed the wedding. The next entry was scrawled, the handwriting wild and broken. The preacher wrote that he'd been told he could not leave, that the forest had accepted him, and now he was part of the bloodline. "They told me I must stay and become one of them," he wrote, the ink bleeding from where his quill pressed too hard. He claimed the air itself had changed, that he could hear whispers under the soil when he prayed, voices calling him by name. The final words of the journal were written in a shaking hand that slanted off the page, "The trees know what I've done. They will not let me go." After that, the pages were blank, and the ink stains at the bottom looked more like fingerprints than words. Years after the hikers found the journal, the cabin was cordoned off by authorities. Word of the discovery spread quickly, drawing the attention of historians, journalists, and forensic teams who wanted to uncover what truth, if any, lay behind the old preacher's words. The property was excavated carefully, each object catalogued and removed under layers of decaying timber and moss. What they unearthed beneath the cabin floor shocked even the most experienced investigators: skeletal remains, dozens of them, arranged in shallow graves. Most were small, belonging to infants or young children, though some were adult bones showing signs of deformities too consistent to be natural. DNA testing began, and the results would later be classified as anomalous, though leaks to the press told a darker story. The samples revealed patterns that defied conventional understanding. Generations of inbreeding had left the genetic structure almost collapsing on itself, creating mutations so severe that experts said survival beyond infancy should have been impossible. Yet among the remains, one skeleton was larger, more developed, suggesting that at least one of the offspring had lived into adulthood. The scientists found evidence of genetic duplication, markers that should not exist in human DNA, leading some to whisper that what had lived in that cabin might not have been entirely human anymore. The investigators who handled the remains spoke of a strange unease that lingered around the site, a heaviness in the air that made their instruments malfunction and their lights dim. One technician claimed that when he brushed soil from a skull, he heard what sounded like faint humming echoing from beneath the ground. Local authorities tried to dismiss the findings as exaggerated, blaming folklore and hysteria for the stories that circulated online. But the forensic reports couldn't be buried so easily. The family line traced through the DNA records matched no living relatives in any public database, as though the bloodline had ended abruptly, erased from history. The journalists who visited the site wrote of the way the forest seemed thicker there, its silence pressing against the ears until it became almost unbearable. One article, quickly removed after publication, mentioned a figure seen among the trees during the excavation, a woman in an old wedding dress, her face obscured by a veil of hair, watching from the shadows. The scientists left eventually, but the land was never reclaimed. The equipment that remained rusted into the soil, and the path to the cabin grew over once again. Even now, those who live near the edge of that forest swear that when the wind shifts just right, they can hear faint singing from somewhere deep inside, like a lullaby carried by voices that should have been gone generations ago. When the last surviving member of the family was finally found, she was living in a crumbling house on the outskirts of a forgotten town 2 states away from the original cabin. The discovery came almost by accident. A social worker following a cold trail of missing documents and unregistered births stumbled upon her name, written in an old census log in handwriting that looked hesitant, as if whoever had written it wasn't sure the person existed at all. She was in her late 70s, thin as paper, her skin marked with veins that branched like roots beneath her flesh. Her eyes, pale gray and unblinking, seemed to carry the color of the woods themselves. When questioned, she answered slowly, with a voice that quivered between clarity and trance, as though she were remembering someone else's memories rather than her own. The investigators asked about the cabin, the wedding, the preacher, but she only smiled faintly and said, "The mountain keeps what it loves." When they pressed for details, she grew still, her fingers tracing the edges of 2 rings hanging from a chain around her neck. One was smaller, delicate, engraved with a faint initial, the other was heavier, made for a man's hand, but both carried the same surname. She admitted they belonged to her mother and to herself, though she used the words mother and sister interchangeably, sometimes even in the same sentence. Her story slipped between decades as if time had dissolved around her. She spoke of growing up in the forest where the trees whispered names she could never repeat, of watching her mother age and then wither until the day she was told she would wear the same dress, recite the same vows, and keep the bloodline pure. The investigators noted her confusion, the inconsistencies, the strange calm with which she described being both daughter and bride to the same family line. When they asked about the preacher, she tilted her head and said, "He stayed too long. The woods took him in." One of the officers, unsettled by her tone, asked about the child, the one born the night of the wedding, but she only laughed softly, a dry sound like leaves turning in the wind. "The forest raises its own," she murmured. Before she died, she pressed the 2 rings into the officer's palm and whispered, "Blood doesn't die. It waits." When they examined her body later, medical reports noted that her DNA sequence contained anomalies identical to those found in the remains from the cabin. It was as though the past had not ended with her but had simply gone dormant, waiting for the forest to wake it again.